Don Quixote. Terry Gilliam spent 29 years trying to finish one movie, and at one point, the disaster was so total that a documentary crew filmed the whole thing falling apart. Gilliam started working on The Man Who Killed Don Quixote back in 1989, and it did not reach screens until 2018. Full pre-production finally came together in 1998 with a budget of around $32 million, raised entirely without American money. The first real shoot began in the year 2000 in Navarre, Spain, with Jean Rochefort as Quixote and Johnny Depp as a modern marketing executive thrown back through time. Within days, everything collapsed. A flash flood tore through the desert location, destroying sets and washing away equipment, and it even changed the color of the surrounding terrain, so nothing matched. Then, Rochefort developed a herniated disc, could no longer ride his horse, and eventually left the production entirely because of illness. Insurance problems and financing trouble piled on top, and the shoot was suspended, then canceled outright. That collapse was captured in the documentary Lost in La Mancha, which came out in 2002 and became famous as a film about a film falling apart. But Gilliam refused to let it go. He and co-writer Tony Grisoni returned to the script in 2009 and dropped the time travel idea. Principal photography finally wrapped on June 4th, 2017, this time with Jonathan Pryce as Quixote and Adam Driver in the lead. The finished film closed the Cannes Film Festival in 2018, nearly 3 decades after Gilliam first began. Fury Road. Mad Max Fury Road looks like it was made in a single furious burst, but George Miller first had the idea back in the late 1980s. He came up with it around 1987, yet the movie did not arrive until 2015. Pre-production started around 1998 and then stalled again and again. After the September 11th attacks in 2001, the American dollar collapsed against the Australian dollar, the budget ballooned overnight, and the whole project was postponed indefinitely. Security concerns and shipping restrictions in the run-up to the Iraq War then wrecked the planned shoot in Namibia. Miller recast his lead along the way, replacing Mel Gibson with Tom Hardy as Max and adding Charlize Theron as Furiosa. And when the team finally set up in the Broken Hill Desert in Australia, unusually heavy rains did something no one could have predicted. The wasteland bloomed. Wildflowers carpeted the landscape, ruining the barren look the film needed, and the production had to pack up and move back to Namibia. Principal photography did not actually begin until July of 2012, more than a decade after pre-production first started. A climate fluke had literally bloomed the apocalypse away. Proof that a movie can be delayed by everything from global finance to the weather. Deadpool. Deadpool exists because 2 minutes of leaked footage did what a decade of studio meetings never could. A film had been kicking around since about 2004, after Ryan Reynolds and writer David Goyer wanted to team up following Blade Trinity. But the rights were tangled between New Line and 20th Century Fox's X-Men films, and it went nowhere. Then, on July 27, 2014, director Tim Miller's test footage leaked online. The response was so overwhelmingly positive that Fox greenlit the movie within weeks. Deadpool hit theaters in 2016, roughly a decade after Reynolds first chased the role. And in 2025, Reynolds finally admitted that he was the one who leaked the footage himself. Boyhood. Some movies took a decade to finish because everything went wrong. Boyhood took 12 years on purpose. Director Richard Linklater shot it a little at a time, from 2002 to 2013, before releasing it in 2014. The plan was almost reckless. He would gather the same cast and crew for a few weeks of filming every single year, capturing a boy named Mason aging from 6 to 18 in real time. Eller Coltrane played Mason, with Patricia Arquette and Ethan Hawke as his parents, and Linklater's own daughter Lorelai as his sister. The distributor, IFC, committed roughly $200,000 a year, about $2.4 million in total across the 12 years. Here is the wild part. The cast could not even sign standard contracts, because a California law bars agreements longer than 7 years, so the entire project ran on nothing but trust that everyone would come back each year. Linklater was so worried about dying before it was done that he reportedly named Ethan Hawke as his backup director. It is the flip side of production hell, a film that took over a decade because the passage of time was the whole point. By the way, if you're enjoying this so far, I make videos like this all the time, and subscribing would genuinely help the channel out. Thanks. Watchmen. Before Zack Snyder ever touched Watchmen, Some of the biggest directors in Hollywood tried to make it and quit, and one of them called it flat out unfilmable. The film was stuck in development from around 1987 until it finally shot in the mid-2000s, close to 2 decades. Producers Lawrence Gordon and Joel Silver first set it up at 20th Century Fox, then moved it to Warner Brothers. Terry Gilliam, the same director behind that Don Quixote saga, was attached to direct, but he walked away, declaring the graphic novel impossible to film, and he could only raise about a quarter of the money he needed. From there, it bounced between Universal, Revolution Studios, and Paramount across the late 90s and early 2000s. Darren Aronofsky signed on at Paramount, then left. Paul Greengrass replaced him, and that version collapsed too. It was only after Warner Brothers saw what Snyder did with his comic adaptation 300 that they finally handed him the project, and Watchmen reached theaters in 2009. It is the classic revolving door story, a book everyone swore could not be filmed, that eventually became famous for how faithful it turned out to be. Roar. Roar was about 11 years in the making, and by the time it was done, it had injured roughly 70 people. Released in 1981, the bulk of its filming spanned 5 brutal years starting in 1976. Director Noel Marshall starred alongside his wife, Tippi Hedren, and her daughter, Melanie Griffith, and they lived and shot with more than 100 untrained big cats. Around 70 cast and crew members were hurt by the animals during production. Cinematographer Jan de Bont was scalped by a lion and needed over 200 stitches. Hedren herself was bitten in the head, and later, when a startled elephant threw her, she suffered a fractured leg. It earns its place on Danger Alone, a movie that took over a decade because the cast was a house full of lions. Thief and Cobbler. One animator spent nearly 3 decades on what he wanted to be the greatest animated film ever made, and then it was taken away from him and finished by someone else. Richard Williams began The Thief and the Cobbler back in 1964, intending it as his masterpiece and a milestone for the entire art form. For almost 30 years, it drifted in and out of production, funded independently, and slowed by some of the most complex hand-drawn animation ever attempted. After Williams won huge acclaim for his animation work on Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Warner Brothers agreed in 1989 to finally finance and distribute the film. But it went over budget and behind schedule, and Disney's similar-looking Aladdin was racing toward theaters. So Williams was forced off his own project. A completion bond company seized control, and producer Fred Calvert cheaply re-edited the footage into a conventional Disney-style musical. Then, in December of 1994, Disney's Miramax bought the rights and recut it even further, layering constant narration from Matthew Broderick and Jonathan Winters over what had been largely dialogue-free animation. Miramax quietly dumped this version, retitled Arabian Night, in August of 1995. It opened on 510 screens and grossed only about $320,000 against an estimated $24 million cost. Williams had even turned down the chance to direct Beauty and the Beast to protect this dream. Years later, fans stitched together their own unofficial restoration, an edit known as the recobbled cut, trying to approximate the film he actually meant to make. It is the tragic version of finishing a movie. It technically got across the line, just never in the form its creator wanted. Gemini Man. Gemini Man sat on a shelf for about 20 years, waiting for technology to catch up to its one big idea. Screenwriter Darren Lemke came up with it in 1997, and it languished in development hell until 2019. The premise, an aging hitman hunted by a younger clone of himself, demanded convincing digital de-aging that simply did not exist for most of that time. Directors including Tony Scott, Curtis Hanson, and Joe Carnahan were all attached at various points. Stars including Harrison Ford, Mel Gibson, and Sean Connery were once lined up to lead. Skydance finally bought the script from Disney in 2016, Ang Lee signed on the next year, and the movie at last starred Will Smith acting opposite a fully digital, younger version of himself. The script had been ready for decades. The one effect at its very core was not. Way of Water. James Cameron made the highest-grossing movie ever, and then he made everyone wait 13 years for the sequel, while he invented a way to film actors underwater. Avatar, The Way of Water, arrived in 2022, 13 years after the original Avatar in 2009. A huge part of that gap came down to one demand. Cameron insisted on capturing his actors' performances underwater, something no one had ever done in the history of cinema. His team built 2 motion capture volumes set just inches apart, one using infrared light above the waterline and one using ultraviolet below, with all the data computed in real time. The actors trained in freediving so they could hold their breath for long stretches, because even stray air bubbles interfered with the capture. The tank at Manhattan Beach Studios held more than 250,000 gallons of water, stretching about 120 feet long and 30 feet deep. Cameron even wrote all the sequels first and shot multiple films worth of performances at once, over roughly 18 months. This was a delay caused entirely by ambition. He could have rushed the sequel out years earlier, but instead, he spent the time building tools that did not previously exist. The Hobbit. The Hobbit reached theaters in 2012, but the fight to make it started back in the mid-90s, and it nearly died inside a studio bankruptcy. Peter Jackson and Fran Walsh began pitching Middle-earth films to Miramax around 1995, before The Lord of the Rings ever existed on screen. The trouble was the rights. They were split and tangled, partly held by a financially struggling MGM. In April of 2008, Guillermo del Toro was announced to direct a two-film version of The Hobbit, and he poured about 2 years into developing it. But MGM's financial crisis ran so deep that the project could not even be officially greenlit. Del Toro finally walked away in May of 2010, after roughly 2 years of waiting on a studio that could not afford to say go. Jackson stepped back into the director's chair himself, and the single book was eventually expanded into 3 films, released across 2012, 2013, and 2014. It is a stark reminder that a movie can be held hostage by a studio's balance sheet. Del Toro did years of work that audiences never saw, simply because the money was not there. Tiefland. The longest and darkest entry on this list is a film whose delay is tangled up with one of the worst crimes of the 20th century. Leni Riefenstahl, best known for making Nazi propaganda films, began developing Tiefland in 1934, and she did not release it until 1954, a span of roughly 20 years. Most of the filming happened between 1940 and 1944, in the middle of the Second World War, and it was still unfinished when the war ended. For scenes shot in 1940, the production used dozens of Roma and Sinti prisoners, taken as extras from the Max Glan internment camp near Salzburg. In 1942, more were taken from the Marzahn camp for scenes near Babelsberg. According to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, many of these Roma and Sinti extras were later returned to the camps and then deported to Auschwitz, where many of them were murdered. After the war, the film's footage was seized and held, which delayed completion for years amid legal and political complications. Riefenstahl finally finished and released Tiefland in 1954, and then spent decades in litigation over those extras. In 1982, the filmmaker Nina Gladitz made a documentary examining the treatment of the Sinti extras. Riefenstahl sued, and a court struck the specific claim that she had known they would be sent to Auschwitz. A related civil case was only dropped in 2002, after her production company retracted a public statement in which she had claimed that all of the extras survived the war. Her account has always conflicted with the documented historical record. Del Toro's Pinocchio. Guillermo del Toro chased his dream version of Pinocchio for roughly 14 years, while studio after studio told him no. It was first announced back in 2008, with an early planned release around 2013 or 2014, before it sank into development hell. Del Toro has called Pinocchio the character he feels the deepest personal connection to, and he dedicated the finished film to his parents. Production was suspended in November of 2017, because no studio was willing to bankroll a dark, stop-motion take on the story. Then Netflix stepped in the following year and revived it. The film finally arrived in 2022, about 14 years after that first announcement, and it went on to win the Academy Award for Best Animated Feature. The idea had been ready for over a decade, it just needed someone willing to pay for it. Welles's final film. The strangest finish on this entire list belongs to a movie whose director had been dead for more than 30 years by the time it was actually done. Orson Welles shot The Other Side of the Wind on and off between 1970 and 1976, and then kept tinkering with the edit well into the 1980s. The film got hopelessly tangled in financial, legal, and political problems, including financing tied to Iran that fell apart with the collapse of the Shah's government. Welles died in 1985 without ever finishing it. Hundreds of reels of his footage then sat locked in a Paris vault for decades, trapped in ownership disputes. Finally, in 2014, a company called Royal Road Entertainment acquired the rights, and producer Frank Marshall, who had actually worked on the original shoot, teamed with director Peter Bogdanovich to complete it. Editors reconstructed the film from Welles's own notes and the surviving footage. It premiered at the Venice Film Festival on August 31st, 2018, and reached Netflix that November, roughly 48 years after shooting first began. It is the ultimate version of this story, a film finished nearly half a century later, long after the man who started it was gone. If you got something out of this video, consider subscribing so you catch every new upload. Thanks for watching.